to hear David Kretzmer talk about the way forward for the legal system in the West Bank. And on Sunday, November 22nd at 8 p.m., to hear Rachel Fish speak on the way forward for peace in the West Bank. This seminar series looks at what steps can be taken in the absence of a peace process to shrink the conflict and improve the lives of Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank. Today's seminar is the way forward for cooperation in the West Bank. We are honored to have as our speaker today, Oded Ravivi, the mayor of Efrat, who is currently serving his third term as mayor. He's a staunch advocate of coexistence and fostering improved relationships with Efrat's neighboring Palestinian villages. From 2016 to 2020, Oded was the chief foreign envoy of the Yesha Council, which represents the 406,000 Israelis residing in Judea and Samaria. In this role, he acted as the official political representative of the Israeli settlement movement to the international community. Oded received a law degree from East London Law School and an MA in social sciences and public policy from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is a graduate of the Givanim Fellowship, a program that fosters the advancement of religious pluralism in Israel. I know there'll be a lot of questions, so please enter your questions in a chat box at the bottom of the screen. I will present these questions to Oded at the end of his talk. We will only take questions from the chat box. Oded, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon from me. Good morning for you. A great honor and opportunity to address this important crowd. Thank you for the invitation. Just that we know the framework, I think I'll be talking briefly for about half an hour, so we can leave more time for questions and answers, because I've got a tendency of talking for a very long period of time about great things which are of great interest for myself, but not necessarily for any interest that you might be joining us today. So I want to try and leave as much time for your questions. And if we see that there are even more questions, either I'll give you more time or I'll just shorten my talk. I would just like to put things in a slight framework. 4.5 years ago, maybe slightly less, I was visiting the United States. It was towards the end of the campaign of the elections before 2016. And I met a news reporter, an author that I'm sure you've all heard of, Thomas Friedman. And we had a very long meeting, and we shared views, experiences, and I explained to him the reality in which I'm running the city of Efrat. Efrat, south of Jerusalem, then you have Bethlehem, and then you have Efrat. They're really joining one another. And Efrat is a relatively small city. At that time, we were about 9,000 people. A city that from one end to another, it's about 5.5 miles. And the width of it, at the most narrowest place, is no more than a traffic circle. And I explained to him that when Efrat was established, the founders of the city, bearing in mind the knowledge that we're bordering the city of Bethlehem, and we're bordering 3 small villages, Wadi Nis, Abdallah Ibrahim, and Wadi Rachel, had an interest of building a city, realizing who the neighbors are, but not wanting to surround the city with a fence. The reasonings were different, and we won't elaborate now, but the question arose, how do you provide security to such a long stretch of a city with bordering Arab villages when you don't have maybe the most basic element of security, which is a fence? And I explained to him that the idea behind it was that if they plan the city in a specific way and they will build it in a specific way, they will be able to create a reality that there's no need to surround the city with a fence. And he was astonished by the idea. And I said to him, we're now, at that time, we're 33 years later, Efrat is still not surrounded by a fence. And we've got very good relationship with our Arab neighbors. The peak of the relationship was two occasions where the head of Wadi Nis, one of the neighboring villages, phones the mayor at that time in the middle of the night and says to him that they see some suspicious movement, people who are taking advantage of the fact that there's no barrier between us, and we should go and check it out. And sure enough, on both those incidents, it was terrorists who wanted to do a terror attack on the city of Efrat. And only due to the awareness of our Arab neighbors, we managed to stop them in due course. He raised his hands to the air and he said to me, Oded, you won't believe it. Finally, I found a settler that thinks like me. So I asked him to explain. And he said, in his view, the world splits into two types of people. Those who live in gated communities surrounded by a fence, and those who are open-minded to explore those who live outside of the small community. I won't go further on to what our conversation was, but I found his analysis quite interesting. Interestingly enough, one of the Israeli TV channels did a few years later a TV documentary program examining gated communities as opposed to non-gated communities. And you won't believe, but the comparison in Israel they brought was Efrat as one scale, one end of the scale, where we're not surrounded by a fence and we're not a gated community, yet we are in Judea and Samaria with all the implications. And the other extreme was one of the tower buildings in Tel Aviv, where they said at the end of the day, you need to have a certain amount of cash to buy an apartment in that building. You need to have a specific request to walk into the building because at the entrance to the building, there's a doorkeeper that doesn't allow anybody to move in. We'll leave that story aside for a second. 4 years ago, literally 4 years ago, on Sunday, I arrived in the United States the Sunday after the elections of 2016. And I take a course in one of the think tanks, and the lecturer starts Sunday morning, and he says, "You have arrived in the United States in the most hysterical times." And I, with my limited English, I look at him and I raise my hand and I say, "You mean historical times?" And he says, no. I meant in one of the most hysterical times. And here we are exactly 4 years later, Sunday morning after the elections. And you can choose for yourself if it's historical times or hysterical times, but it seems like the wheel is just turning on. And obviously, none of us had anticipated what will happen in the last 4 years. Maybe some will say that they did anticipate. I can admit that when I had discussions with friends of the Democratic Party in the States, they asked me if the embassy is going to move to Jerusalem. And I said, I don't think there's any chance that they're going to move to the embassy to Jerusalem. And we all know that that is one of the things that did happen in the last 4 years. But shortly after the inauguration, which I was also honored to be invited 4 years ago, I met Jason Greenblatt in Jerusalem after he was nominated by the president to be the chief foreign envoy for the peace negotiations. And we sat in the King David, and I don't know how many of you have had the chance of meeting Jason Greenblatt, but he's a very intelligent lawyer. You sit with him, he asks the questions, you give the answers, and you can't tell from his body language if he agrees with you or doesn't agree with you. And I told him the story of Efrat, how unique it is, the type of cooperation we have with our Arab neighbors. Maybe the most significant issue of security is something which is almost of non-concern that we have in the relationship with our Arab neighbors. And he basically asked me the question which I think the seminar is about: how do I see the future? What needs to happen in order for something to be more successful? And I gave him my analysis. which said to him the following thing. Number one, we all remember, we all learned what Albert Einstein told us, that if you carry on doing what you've always tried to do, you shouldn't expect any other result than what you've received in the past. So if we want a different result, we need to try and change what we're doing. When I was invited to give this talk, one of the papers that I was referred to was Micha Goodman's paper about Catch 67. I don't know if it was still mentioned, if it's still relevant, if everybody's really read it. But in a sense, Micha Goodman wrote his paper because of a sense of a feeling that we're in a deadlock, we're in a standstill, nothing is moving forward. And he tried to analysis in his philosophical mannerism, which I might touch further on. We'll see how much time we have left. But basically, I told Jason Greenblatt that in order not to be in a situation of Catch 67, we need to try and do something differently. Because the way I see it, and when you examine the timeline, there's a conflict today, there was a conflict after 1967, but the truth of the matter is that there was a conflict prior to 1967, before there was any Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria. And if we want to be really honest, there was a conflict after the War of Independence in 1948, but there was also a conflict prior to the independence of the State of Israel. So it doesn't really matter if there's a one state, a two state, or no state. The conflict has been the most permanent resident in this region. And in order to change it and move out the conflict, we need to try and do something different. The second thing that I suggested was adopting the approach that was put as the foundations of the city of Efrat, taking a concept of bottom up, building the relationship on the ground as the reality is, how the people interact with one another, and try and raise that into a national level. And the third thing, which is a practical suggestion, is try and find small, little initiatives which can build the trust of the two parties in order to try and reach something which is better. A few months later, I meet Jared Kushner. All these people might be already names of history and irrelevant for this session today, but this is what happened in the last 4 years. And what do I hear Jared Kushner saying? We have learned from the mistakes of the past. We don't want to repeat the mistakes that were done in the past. We're looking for small initiatives to build the trust, and we want to work bottom up. I'm not taking any credit for what Jared said. Jason might have passed the information, might have not passed the information, but you can understand that I did affiliate with the message that was conveyed. And then we had different talks, different negotiations throughout the year, until January this year, when we were rushed to DC to hear the declaration of the Trump deal. And I was one of those who mainly supported the Trump deal. I supported it because I thought that it looked in the reality the way it is. It started from a bottom-up approach. It went and examined where do people actually live, understanding that if you uproot people from their homes, if you demolish houses that were built, it will be very difficult to engage the people moving forward. I have a feeling I know what Professor Kretschmer is going to talk to you next week, because I grew up in the same community, in the same shul that he used to go to. And I know what his views are. And you have to remember, when you seek advice from a legal advisor, and this is coming from somebody who was a lawyer, there are always two sides to the argument. One of the days before I became a mayor and I was a lawyer, I came back from court and I was frustrated. And I told the secretary, you know, half of our clients are liars. And she looks at me puzzled and she says to me, why do you say such a thing? And I said, I went to court, I have to argue one case. The other side hired a lawyer and he argues the opposite. And the poor judge sitting on the bench needs to decide who is telling the truth and who is lying. And not only that, each one of us hired experts to prove that our theory is the right one, and the judge still needs to make a decision who is lying and who is telling the truth. So I'm not going to have a whole dialogue with Professor Kretschmer when he is absent here, but I'm just giving you an advance warning. There are two sides to the argument. But the Trump deal ignored that argument. Some say for better, some say for worse. Looked at the reality on the ground and said, where people live, that will create a conceptual map. And let's start moving forward from what has been created on the ground now. Now, it made sense. It created a new map. It didn't force the parties to go back to the 1967 border, because that border, first of all, it's not an official border. Second of all, to be accurate, it's the line of the ceasefire of the War of Independence. It hasn't been accepted by anyone internationally. And we're already 53 years down the road where the reality has changed, and the conceptual map made a lot of sense to me. I have to admit, not all my peers, the mayors in Judea and Samaria, like that approach. And here there's another example of what Micha Goodman actually refers to in his article. There is a unique, crazy coalition between the far right and the far left, who both rejected the Trump deal for different reasons, but none of them wanted to see something moving forward in a way of a compromise. The second idea was in the Trump deal that basically nothing is being decided for the future. We're going into negotiations where the parties will determine how far they want to go, how quickly they want to go, but the elements mentioned in Micha Goodman's article regarding Israel security, regarding Israel interests, will be kept. And I thought, again, that was good foundations for something moving forward. Again, no need to elaborate. You all know how things developed. We ended up ignoring that suggestion, finding ourselves with all sorts of treaties with countries in the Gulf, where I have to admit, I was, as I said, in DC the day the declaration was made. The night before it was made, we had a meeting with a senior official from the White House who explained to us what I heard during the inauguration of President Trump, something which you as Americans understand. We Israelis don't always understand the English, definitely don't understand the translation. He said, America first. Israelis don't always understand it. Sometimes Israelis think America first, but Israel and America are at the same level. And it doesn't go like that. And we were explained in that meeting that the declaration has things which will benefit the state of Israel, but there are also interests that the American administration wants to promote, specifically before the elections, and this is prior COVID-19, and before they anticipated the whole chaos of what we live in through today. And they thought that if they will bring these financial agreements with the Gulf states, they will be able to help them during the elections. Today, we know slightly different reality. But there was here an opportunity where it served the American interest, it served an Israeli interest, and we could have moved forward. Micha Goodman's 8 steps to solving the conflict is slightly problematic, and I'll tell you why. First of all, there are 2 versions. There's an English version and there's an Hebrew version. And we all know when you translate, you give interpretation. But what I found as one of the key disturbing points in the article is that he suggests taking such steps with concept, but without agreement. Now, when I was introduced to the article by Barry, he said unilateral acts. But in the Hebrew version, he says something else, doing something with agreement, but without with consent, but without agreement. Now, this is too philosophical, and this is coming from a philosophical writer, which is good, is challenging. But when we face reality, we have to examine it in practical manners. Micha Goodman's article, just like you found it interesting and shared it, he was invited by the members of Knesset of Blue and White to give them the introduction to their office as members of Knesset in their first meeting in the Knesset. It was Friday, and he came for a special talk to introduce his concept. And again, as an intellectual, as a philosophic leader, that might be interesting. But political leaders are looking for practical ideas. And therefore, I think that the suggestion of moving bottom up, building the trust, is the foundation for changing the reality in Judea and Samaria. Now, when COVID-19 is beyond us and when you can board airplanes again, and I hope you all come to Efrat and I'll be able to host you, I would be happy to take you for a short tour very close to Jerusalem, 15 minutes down the road, where you can see Jews and Arabs going to the same shopping centers and shopping one alongside the other. You can go into a health clinic and seeing Jews and Arabs receiving treatment one alongside the other. Why? Because those are the day-to-day necessities of life that the people who live on the ground understand, that if we don't find the ways to live one alongside the other, a solution brought by a third party won't bring us any closer to a peaceful resolution. And it is yet not known, at least to me, what type of policy the new administration is going to take. Are they going to go in the footsteps of what President Obama had in his 8 years? Or they're going to look at what has been created in the last 4 years by the Trump administration and maybe see some benefit in it and try and move forward? My suggestion, if I would be asked by any personnel in the new administration, is not to ignore what happened in the last 4 years just because it was brought to the table by a rival political party, but to try and see what the benefits of it were and to try and move forward from where we stopped at the moment. I think I'll stop here and I'll see if there are any questions, and then we'll see where those take us to. So have we got any questions, Barry?
Yes, we do. So first of all, I want to just have my own question here, and that is, Mika Goodman's article. What he said, was really trying to find ways to reduce the conflict, and that was really the inspiration for this series. In that, I know from your own experience in Efrat, steps have been taken, and I was hoping you could go into them as to what steps you've taken with your Arab neighbors or Palestinian neighbors to basically make life better for Israelis and for Palestinians. Because the question is, he's basically saying nothing's ever going to really improve. What can we do to make things better? And that's kind of what I'm kind of like to hear your viewpoint on.
Okay, so as you mentioned, Barry, I've been the mayor of Efrat for over 12 years. And one of the first incidents, which happened completely by mistake and unintentionally, sometimes a lot of things happen in life by mistake and you don't really intend for them to end up like they end up, was that on the first few days, I'm being given a tour of the city and I'm being shown the water tank of Efrat. And I'm also told that this water tank supplies water to 2 of the 3 villages which are bordering Efrat. And from the water tank, I'm being taken to the emergency warehouse, where I'm being shown a cabinet on the wall with 2,000 1-gallon containers of water. And I asked, why are there 2,000 containers of gallons of water? And they say to me, because if we have a water crisis, we've got 1,800 families in Efrat, and then we need to give each family 1 gallon of water for quick emergency. Now, I'm a mayor just a day or two, so I ask a stupid question and I say, but you just explained to me that the water tank supplies also water for the Arab villages. Now, if we supply them water on a day-to-day basis, if there's a water crisis for the people in Efrat. There will be a water crisis for the people in the villages, and they will come to the nearest well and they will ask for water. They will come to us and ask for water. So the answer I get was, you must have forgotten, you weren't voted in by the people of these Arab villages. The people in Efrat are the ones who voted you in. You need to make sure that you look after the interests of the people in Efrat. And I said in response, but that is part of looking after the interest of the people of Efrat. So I go back to the office and I send a letter to the Minister of Defense, because he's in charge of emergency. And I explain what I've just discovered. And I ask for another few hundred gallons of water for the people in the neighboring villages. Surprise, surprise, it never happened to me since then. After a week, a big truck pulls into Efrat with the gallons of water that I have asked for the Arab villages in case there is a water crisis for them as well. A few days later, I receive a phone call from one of the heads of the Arab villages. He wants to meet me. My secretary knows when they ask for a meeting, everything is being put off and we set a meeting. For two reasons. Number one is their respect needs to be seen, that we respect them and we admit them immediately. And number two, you can't postpone those meetings because it means that there's something that needs to be dealt with here and now. And we set a meeting for the next day, and they show up with a whole delegation of all the most respectable people in the village. I look slightly puzzled and I say, what's this meeting about? And they say, we've come to say to you, thank you for looking after our interest. Now, it is such a silly example. It is so little effort being put into, yet it has built the trust of those Arab villages with Efrat, or for me as a new mayor, because at the end of the day, the relationship always existed. Rav Riskin, who was one of the founders of the city, always put it as his emphasis of building a good relationship with our Arab villages. Now, that is just one example. I mentioned in my introduction that we have an emergency medical facility. That emergency medical center was set up because during the years of the Intifada, a pregnant lady who had to give birth couldn't get to Jerusalem because they were shooting over the road from Efrat to Jerusalem. So the doctors, and we have a lot of doctors in Efrat, we have out of a population of 15,000 people, we've got over 150 doctors. That's a very high ratio. They said to the mayor at that time, listen, if you just give us a rooftop, we've got the knowledge, so we can do medical procedures. They saw it was so successful, they've built today a whole complex which literally looks like a hospital with an X-ray machine, with a ultrasound machine, with all the equipment for a surgery room. But these doctors know how to go to the Arab villages and give treatment to people who need treatment. The neighbors from the Arab villages, they know how to come to Efrat in case they seek medical treatment. Even today, when you hear all the headlines that there's no negotiation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, there's no cooperation, they're not collecting the money from taxpayers, still, when their leaders need medical treatment, they're being rushed to the hospitals in Israel. They receive the highest medical treatment they can receive. And in Israel, we had 3 weeks ago an incident where one of the most leading Palestinian leaders, a well-known terrorist in the past, was rushed to hospital because of COVID-19. He was given life support treatment. His life was saved, and there was a whole discussion whether we need to let him die because he was a terrorist and he sent lots of terrorists to kill lots of Israelis, or do we need to heal him and make him feel better? At the end of the day, for the leaders of the country, there was no argument. They gave him the treatment, they sent him back home. But these acts, at the end of the day, I think put more in perspective how the conflict is run and how deep is the conflict or how not deep the conflict is.
Okay, thank you. Another question. How do the mayors of the neighboring Arab towns regard the PA leadership?
That is an excellent question. And I will take this question as an opportunity to give you another example of an incident that happened. One Saturday night, I get paged that there was a traffic accident at the northern entrance to Efrat. Okay, I'm the mayor. You don't expect me to go out and give first aid to that accident, right? We're just updating you that there was a car who ran over a girl who's 6 years old. Okay, I asked, was the a medical team called to the accident? Yes, and they're actually on the scene at the moment. They're actually trying to resuscitate her. A few minutes later, I'm being updated that unfortunately they had to declare death of that young girl. There was no way to save her life. Again, I say, I'm sorry to hear, but they say to me, Oded, it's not that simple. You have to understand. The young girl, 6 years old, was run over by an Israeli driver, a resident of Efrat, and of course, she is an Arab. She's not only an Arab, but her twin sister witnessed the whole accident. I asked, are the police on the scene? The police are on the scene, they're investigating the accident, but it seems like the driver wasn't at fault at all because the girl jumped into the street in a curve that he couldn't see her beforehand, and unfortunately, those were the tragic results of that accident. 3 hours later, the commander of the army phones me up and he says to me, Oded, we have a problem. I said, what's the problem? He said, have you heard about the road accident? I said, yes, but I understood that it was dealt by the police and no fault at the driver's side. So the commander of the army says to me, yes, but the Palestinian Authority have come out in a campaign on social media that that young girl is a martyr and she was run over intentionally by the settlers who've opened now in a battle of running over and killing young kids of the Palestinian Authority. Now, if it wasn't obvious up until now, that is definitely not the way that we act here. I found that accusation very disturbing. And I thought to myself, what can I do and try to lower the flames? So I convey a message to the people of the village that that young girl came from. It is quite a hostile village. I haven't been in that village for at least 26 years since my military service, maybe even more. And I set a date that I want to go and pay my condolences to the family of that young girl. And I drive to that village, not updating my wife beforehand that that's what I'm doing, because she would have stopped me beforehand. Going into that village unescorted, unprotected, because you need to show the respect that you're respecting those people. And I enter to the village all by myself. I come to that house, and there are big signs of Hamas outside the house, praising this young girl who has been a martyr. I'm being asked to walk into the men's room, and there's a ladies' room on the other side. I'm being asked to sit next to the grandfather because he's the only one who speaks Hebrew in the whole crowd. And we start having a little talk, and he says to me, why can't we go back to the reality prior to 1967? You won't believe it. I volunteered in a kibbutz up in the north, and I had a tractor company, and I used to live in that kibbutz. And all the anti-tank tunnels that you know that there are in the Golan Heights, I'm the one who dug them for the state of Israel. Why can't we go back to that reality? And all of a sudden, I see out of the window a big black limousine with Palestinian Authority flags, signs on both doors, bodyguards coming out of the car. You understand where my heart was at that moment. And there was no way to call anybody for assistance. And I asked them, what's this car all about? And they say, oh, this is the mayor of El Khadr. And this is where we come to your question. On a regular basis, I can't meet any of the Arab mayors. Why? Because they are appointed by the Palestinian Authority. And they won't meet with me because then that will amount into cooperation with the Zionist enemy. But when the mayor of El Khadr heard that I was coming into his village, he said, this is an opportunity for me. And he came to meet me. At that time, they thought that they were going to have elections for mayors of their cities. So he came with a whole shopping list of things he wanted me to help him to achieve in order to increase his chances of being re-elected. have more water permits, have more building permits, have permits to work in Israel, all sorts of different issues. The last item on the list was there was also to beautify the entrance to the village, to clear all the garbage that was there. But the last item was to put speed bumps on the road where the accident took place. I look at the whole list. They're all out of my jurisdiction. They're all out of my authority. I could have said to him, hey man, you've addressed the wrong guy. But I take it, I fold it, and I put it in my pocket. Luckily enough, that evening, I met the chief commander of the Central District of the Army. And I said to him, you won't believe what happened today. I visited this village, Al-Khadr. I haven't been there for over 25 years. And this is what happened. And I present him the list. And the commander of the Central District takes the list and he says to me, you know what, Oded? The last item, speed bumps, no problem. I'll install them for you. Now, for me to install speed bumps in the city of Efrat is a procedure of about 3 years. I need to have experts' opinion. I need to open it for public opinion, opposition, have a vote. It will take me at least 3 years. But the army, when they want to do something, within no time, 2 days, the road bumps were there to slow down the traffic. This whole story happened just a few weeks before I had the gathering in my house when I invited Palestinian people to celebrate with us the holiday of Sukkot. And all of a sudden, amongst the people who came, there was the grandmother of that young girl who was run over. I didn't invite her, but the meeting wasn't secret, it was public. So I asked her, how come she's arrived? And she says to me, listen, I've come to say thank you for making sure that there won't be any more accidents like the tragic event of my granddaughter. Now, you can learn from this story two things. Number one is that at the end of the day, people to people, we can build bridges which are going to be way stronger than any fence created in order to provide security. And number two is that at the end of the day, by very small incidents which involve very little investment, you can sometimes create trust and a better future that is definitely worth the investment. I took the story. I met with 2 generals in the army and I said, look, with very little investment, we can create benefit and saving in the investments in security. Those 2 generals accepted my theory. They scheduled a meeting for me with the chief of staff that I met with him for over 2 hours in my office, gave him a whole list of stories that Barry wanted me to elaborate about, but we don't have time. And at the end of the day, he looks at me and he says to me, Oded, I completely agree with you. But above me, there are politicians. And then they don't always see the reality the way that you see it. And in a way, it was a frustrating meeting because I could see that there is a path to go forward, but there are limits that we can't break through. And that brings me back again to what I suggested to Jason. Let's try bottom up, because if you build the foundations on the ground level, if we can find a mechanism how to meet mayors to mayors, it's so significant now during COVID-19. There are no borders. The city of Bethlehem is bordered on the one side with the city of Jerusalem, on the other side with the city of Efrat. The city of Bethlehem, when COVID-19 started, was the #1 city in Israel or in the Palestinian Authority with the most reported cases of COVID-19. There are issues just like global warming, just like all the issues which cross borders, that if we don't know how to build these coalitions, then we won't have any better future. I'll just conclude with one day I was summoned by the American embassy around 12 o'clock at lunchtime. They phone me up and they say, listen, there's a delegation of 8 senators at the moment in Gaza, led by Lindsey Graham and Chris Cottons, all the leading senior senators. And the tour is not going well. It's a bi-party delegation, but they're coming out with the impression of to to stop the foreign aid to the Gaza Strip. And we want you to address them. Now, when you get such a phone call, you don't start negotiating the terms and conditions of you addressing these delegations of 8 senators. I put on my suit and I show up at the King David at 8 o'clock at night after they had their dinner. I didn't quite know what was anticipated of me. I'm from Judea. They were in Gaza. I'm definitely not an expert in international relationships. What do they want me to talk about? And very quickly, the American senators said to me, Oded, we're going back to the States. We're going to suggest to stop foreign aid to the Gaza Strip. So I look at them and I say to them, why? And they say, because the foreign aid is being diverted into causes that are against the policy of our administration. And I said to them, listen, I'm no expert in what your policy is, but I can just tell you one thing. If that is the suggestion you're going to take back home, we will find ourselves with money coming into the Gaza Strip from more extreme governments that we have no control over what the money is being used for. So what we need to work on is trying to fine-tune the mechanism as to how the money is being transferred, to make sure that it's being transferred to causes which are worthwhile and are really going to bring a better future to the people in Gaza. And then we can move forward. So what I'm saying is that if we manage to build those mechanisms with the administration or with the Palestinian Authority, because I'm not one of those who says, let's change the leadership and then we can move forward. The people choose their leadership. And if they don't choose it in a democratic mechanism like you have in the United States, and it's leaders who rule for as many years as they rule, so we need to find a mechanism as to how the people of the Palestinian Authority will have enough power over their people in order to make them engage in worthwhile achievement.
So are there you said that a lot of this has to be done on the ground. And I guess the question is, does your philosophy have any other settlements or Jewish villages along or towns down like through Hebron or whatever, have they picked up on this way of thinking?
So I have to admit, I've taken my theory into a level of a tourist attraction. And prior to COVID-19, people didn't believe it, but on top of me running the city, I used to host about 300 delegations a year. And I think that's how I met Barry when he was in Israel. And when I'm usually asked this question, are you a lone ranger or are there more people like you? And I even once had a discussion with the Washington Institute, and I suggested to them to do a survey, to go and examine if the good relationship between Efrat and the bordering Arab villages can give us scientific findings that those villages are less involved in terror attacks, that they are more for some sort of settlement, some sort of compromise, that they are more rational, if we can engage with them in different topics. They didn't accept my suggestion. Maybe when I'll retire, I'll work in one of those institutions and I'll be able to suggest it more firmly. But when I was negotiating with the institution, they said to me, bring us an example of another city, not just the front. And I started exploring from the north of Samaria all the way down to the south of the Judean hills. And you know what I found out? That all the mayors engage with their Arab neighbors. We've got the industrial areas all over Judea and Samaria, which we call islands of peace, because you see Arab and Jewish workers working on the same conveyor belt, having together a lunch break, and at the end of the day, also going and socializing together. It is true that not everybody is willing to express it and vocal it as loudly as I'm doing so. But you don't have to look too hard in order to see these examples actually happening on the ground. And I will just conclude with one more thing. When I do have arguments with my peers as to how the future needs to look here, I say to them the following thing. If we honestly believe that we have the right to live in Judea and Samaria, and we don't want anybody to remove us from here, and if the Arabs want to live here as well, and they believe that they have to right to live here, and they don't want to be evacuated from here. It is our duty to find the ways how we can live one alongside the other without having a third party interfering. And most people, even if they won't agree with the level that I've taken this relationship to, agree that it is up to us to show how we can live one alongside the other. Because if we can't demonstrate living one alongside the other, then the demands, the calls for separation will come very quickly. At the end of the day, on most days, there's no conflict, there's no violence. It is true that what is reported is only the bloodshed and the horrific events which I condemn, all my peers condemn, we're all against. But on a regular basis, people drive the same roads, shop in the same supermarkets, and I think that's what needs to be the focus on.
So how are you able to keep extremists out? You know, it almost feels like you're in one sense you're like sitting ducks, you know, with Hamas or whatever. How do you do that?
I think that is the $1 million question. And you know what? When you go and examine conflicts all around the world, you will find out that that is the essence of the conflict. In all conflicts, you have a small, extreme, loud, violent minority. Sometimes they're also even more than violent. And they are the ones who get the attention. They're the ones who get the exposure. And you don't hear the vast, silent majority. Now, in this conflict, there's an extra element on that. The small, extreme, loud, violent minority also have a financial interest in seeing the conflict carrying on. Why? Because they live out of the conflict. I'm often hosting delegations who visit Efrat after they visited Bethlehem, a refugee camp. And they say to me, have you seen their refugee camp? They're so horrific. People live in situations that none of us would have wanted to live. How can you even stay awake, understanding that that's the reality in which they are living in, and you're not doing some actions in order to benefit their livelihood? And you won't find any Israeli saying to you, I am a second, third, fourth generation of refugee. My grandparents ran away from Europe. I never say I'm a third generation of refugees. Why? Because the people of Israel took their future in their hands, created this imaginary state. Israel is so advanced in so many things that, have you heard of global warming? You can't answer, you're all on mute, so I would say you've heard of global warming. We in Israel haven't heard of global warming, not because we followed President Trump's headline, but because Israel is the only country in the world that the desert is actually growing smaller. How is that possible? Because Israel has built a mechanism of collecting all the sewage water, purifying it into a level of drinking water, and taking the purified water, the purified sewage water, and shifting it for agricultural purposes. And that's why in Israel, the desert is growing smaller every day. We've basically got an endless supply of water because whatever falls from the sky falls from the sky, but whatever becomes sewage is being reused. Now, during the Oslo Accord, one of the foundations, one of the major chapters that were signed and agreed upon was the issue of water. And in order to secure the relationship, they calculated how many people live here, how many people live there, how much water there is in the natural resources. And Israel had to supply an extra amount of water in order to guarantee that there will be enough water for the Palestinian Authority. The European community, overlooking the agreement a minute before it was signed, said, we've heard that Israel has developed this technology. We want to adopt it in the Palestinian Authority. And they were willing to fund building such enterprises. Now we're now 26 years later. Do you know how many purifying centers have been built for the Palestinian Authority? Thank you, Mr. Kempler. Not even one. The funds were transferred up until the last dime by the European community. Where did all the funds go to? Today, we know that they all ended up in private Swiss bank accounts of the leaders of the Palestinian Authority. Now, this is not what I'm saying. This Palestinian Authority today is suffering from a financial problem because foreign aid has dropped between 70 to 80% because the international community has realized that the leaders were misusing the fund. So when they had a financial incentive to carry on having the conflict and carrying on showing refugee camps as their situation, it used to be a source of income. Europe is in a financial difficulty. The United States is in a financial difficulty. There aren't any more those international funds to be transferred to the leaders. And this is where we are in opportunity to enhance the bottom-up approach and try and see how on local issues we can try and set the foundations for something which can be adopted in larger scale.
So how have BDS activities affected you, if at all?
I want to be careful with my answer, and I'll tell you why, because I could say they haven't affected at all. And I'll give you two examples. One is very well known, the other one is completely not known. The very well known is SodaStream, right? There were sanctions against the administration of SodaStream, the owners of SodaStream. The factory was east of Jerusalem in an area called Ma'ale Domim, and the owners of the factory threatened, if you don't close your factory, we will have sanctions against you. We will boycott your products. And the owner of the company thought twice, and he did a financial calculation, closed the factory, moved it to a place by Kiryat Gat. The shares of the company went higher. And you know what? The only people who lost out were the few thousand Arab workers who worked in that factory. There were no big celebrations of BDS. We succeeded. We closed SodaStream in the occupied territories. There's no more production of soda in Judea and Samaria because they found out that they scored their own goal. Basically, SodaStream is worth now more because of its new location. Those who lost out were the workers who worked for them. A second example is a winery in Efrat, or in the junction just next to Efrat. And I had a talk with the owner of the winery, and he says to me, here, look, this is the wine we're producing. And I see that on the label, it says, produced in Judea and Samaria, according to the requirements of those who want labeling on the product. So I look at him puzzled and I say, why are you cooperating? He says, Odez, you don't understand. I said, please explain. He says, we're marketing also to South America. In South America, when we write, and there's no requirement there to label the product, but labeling the product has become a label of quality, and they're seeking the labeling in order to purchase our goods because that's an indication of where the wine was raised or brought up, and that's why our selling points have grown even higher because of this labeling. So here are two examples where it doesn't really bother us. But the main concern about BDS is not about really the boycotting, but the story which is being told above it and on top of it. And that's, I think, where is this disturbing issue. Because at the end of the day, in a world which has difficulty in differentiating between true and false, between what is right and what is wrong, we find those incidents becoming more and more widely spread, spreading rumors and accusations about a reality which is not really the reality. And I think that's the major concern regarding the BDS movement.
Earlier, we were talking about how these villages, that your neighboring villages, to meet with them, you have to kind of go through the PA. And do any of these villages stand up to the PA? Or what are the chances of them doing that?
The truth of the matter is that the higher you go, the less you will find those people willing to stand up opposite the Palestinian Authority. My hosting Palestinian neighbors in Efrat started after basically during my introduction to the office. I was told I have to go and visit them whenever they have holidays, and that's the way we show respect. And I go into the Arab village at least 2-3 times a year whenever they had their holidays, their festivals, and went to celebrate with them. One year, I think it was about 5 years ago, we had two terrible terror attacks south of Efrat towards Hebron and Kiryat Arba. And I go and show my condolences to both those families, where two families, their lives turned upside down. And when I go out of the mourner's house, I look in my diary and I see that now I have to go to Wadi Nis because they're celebrating one of their festivals. And I go into Wadi Nis, and usually I'm being greeted by a delegation of about 10 people. This time, there was a delegation of about 40 men waiting for me. I could understand that there was something in the air, that there was some excitement. And I come into the house, and they want me to sit at the head of the table where there are food and beverages. And I say to them, listen, guys, it just doesn't sit well today. I've just come from these two families that their lives are turned upside down. A young girl, 12 years old, slaughtered in her bed. A young rabbi killed whilst driving, his wife next to him, his 3 kids witnessing the whole event. 2 terrible events. I can't now sit around the festive meal and pretend as if I didn't have the morning schedule. And they say to me what they always used to say. We condemn violence, we are for peace, we want good relationships, we want to protect our neighbors, all the right things. And I say to them, listen, guys, it's all a little too little and a little too mellow. It's not enough. Halfway through the meeting, they did something they've never done before. They've taken out these stupid devices, they start taking photos, and before I get back to my office, I get tagged on Facebook messages. We love Mayor Revivi. Thank you for coming. We want you to become our mayor. We condemn violence. We like peace. All those right things. I thought, wow, they finally gone public. They're finally willing to state what they really believe in. A day later, they phone me up and they say to me, we've been thinking about it. So, what have you been thinking about? Well, you see, when you come and visit us, you always come to our house. When we come and visit you, we always come to your office. What do I say in response? You don't have an office. That's why you come. That's why I come to your house. So they said to me, no, you've missed the message. So what's your point? You've never invited us for an official reception in your house. So I said to them, you know what, guys, to be honest with you, I try not to mix business with pleasure. I've never held any official reception in my house. I don't want to mix business with pleasure. But you know what? Because you raised it in such a mannerism, I'll do a reception in your honor in my house. And to cut a long story short, we schedule it for the festival of Sukkot. I asked them, how many of you want to come? They say, we'll come about 10. So I thought there'll be 10 of them. I'll invite 20 neighbors. And I also invited the local policeman and the local army officer, because those of you who visited Efrat, those of you who've been in Judea and Samaria, you know that the police and the army have a role here. The due date, the due time arrives. The first delegation to arrive are the Palestinians. I invited 10. They show up 30 people. They've all put their Sunday best on, half a bottle of aftershave. You could see, you could smell that they were excited from the meeting. I invited 20 neighbors. I end up with 80 neighbors at the door. You're all laughing. The response I got from my wife didn't really bring me to a situation that I was laughing. But the local policemen and the local army, they were really puzzled how to respond to such an invitation. They've never been invited to such an event. So what do you do when you work in such an organization? Each one of them reported to higher in command, and I end up with a delegation of 30 officers from the army and the police, led by a general from the army and an equivalent rank from the police. And everybody was talking about what was happening. The general which attended said the following thing: the more social gatherings like this that there will be, the less the Israeli government will have to invest in security. Wow, what a genius. He didn't say anything that I could take out to the media and say, hey guys, look, I had a meeting with Palestinians, Arabs, Jews, police officers, army officers. There was nothing to report about. But the Palestinians, they were so excited to see an Israeli officer, never mind an Israeli general, in full guard, not in a conflict. What did they want to do? Selfies. So they were queuing up to take selfies with the general. And what do you do when you take selfies?
No.
Put it on social media. That's what they did. The following day, we get reports that 4 of them have been arrested by the Palestinian Authority for interrogation under the accusation of negotiating peace with the Zionist enemy without being authorized to do so. Now, give me a break. There was coffee, tea, some jokes, no peace negotiation. But the Palestinian Authority couldn't uphold the picture of a Palestinian standing next to an Israeli officer, never mind an Israeli general, that everybody is smiling. As far as I'm concerned, that is the picture of no conflict that exists. The story behind it is the conflict which is being told about, which can be erased if we will take the real caption that was taken. Jews and Arabs sitting in a sukkah, having coffee together. The sky is the limit as to what we could have discussed, where we could have reached. It was stopped the day after when they were arrested for interrogation. It took me 4.5 days, $15,000 that I raised from donations in order to pay, in order to get them out of, to bribe the people that were keeping them behind bars. And this was already 5-6 years ago. I'll tell you a secret. Since then, we've been meeting every single year. It's become a tradition. They were arrested one more time. We got over that as well. This year, we didn't meet up because of COVID-19. But as far as I was concerned, this year was maybe the most exciting one. Because 10 days before Sukkot, they sent me a message, Oded, this year we want to help you build your sukkah and we want to be part of the whole getting organized. But unfortunately, social distance prevailed and we weren't able to meet. So we hope that we'll find another opportunity to meet up.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I have just one question that seems to have popped up a few times, and this will be the last question. And what do you think about the possible incoming Democratic administration and how that will affect Israel?
So I'm just typing my email on the chat. So if any of you didn't have a chance to ask any questions and you want to ask me something, so you've got now my email, and just feel free to send me an email. I'll be more than happy to answer you. Obviously, ever since last night, the media in Israel is bothered with what type of administration the president elected is going to bring with him, what type of people he's going to bring in with him to the White House. People are afraid, asking, are you afraid of what's going to happen? And I think I answered it in the opening statements. I think I'm left with more question marks than fear feelings. It is really yet to see what type of policy the new administration will adopt. I've learned that presidents in their first term are acting differently than what they act in the second term. In a way, there is a potential that a new president on his first term might even surprise for the better than what people are expecting, or what would have happened with a president serving in a second term. I think we can't ignore the fact that President Trump was extremely good and helpful in a lot of the causes that we were praying for many years. I am not sure that President Biden will really take the same policies that he was in the administration as vice president under Obama. I think he's coming with more experience, maybe wiser, maybe with a desire to satisfy more publics of people, to try and show that he's really coming in a more objective approach. And I think we'll see within the next few weeks, first of all, if the results are really determined to be the official results, and then to see what type of people are actually being put in the different positions in this administration. And then we'll have to work hard to build the bridges with the new administration, because I have to admit, unfortunately, throughout these 4 years, I've tried to maintain a relationship with both parties, understanding that I can't guarantee that the results will always be that a specific party will be in the administration. Not everybody in Israel sees it that way. Not all Israelis understand American politics. Not all Israeli politicians understand what is America first. And I think we as Israelis need to make sure that we can build a relationship with both parties at any given time on any given topic. And I think that's the challenge for the next 4 years.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us. This has been very, very educational. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us.
My pleasure. And as I said, if anybody's got questions that we didn't have a chance to discuss, you've got my email, and I'll be more than happy to answer and address them. And especially after the next two sessions that you have, where I won't be present, but you're going to hear different people. If you think that things I've said weren't backed by them, or there's a different approach, I'll be more than happy to try and wrap it up or give you my answers and my views.
Well, you're invited. I'll send you the schedule. You're invited to join us. So,
thank you very much.
Yeah, next week we're having David Kretzmer at 10 a.m. next Sunday, and the following week we're having Rachel Fish on at 8 p.m. So, anyway, thank you again.
Thank you so much.